right, we're now going to go over what everybody seems to know with Andrew Jackson, which is the removal of the Indians. At this time, there was what was called the 5 civilized tribes. They were called the civilized tribes because they had to adopt to the white man's way of living when we had moved into Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia, and all these places. They had lost their hunting grounds, had lost areas to think, and so they had gone to living in some cabins, farming, and things like that. But the big reason you're going to see these civilized tribes removed and everything isn't that Andrew Jackson just hated the Native Americans or he wanted to get rid of them. Andrew Jackson had ran on the fact of, we're going to erase national debt. We are going to be a country that has 0 in the debt column. And this goes back to the fact he is a common man. If you were to take a common person like me and I owed a debt to my credit card company, I'm going to pay that by doing one of 2 things. I'm either going to cut back on things that I have, or I'm going to sell something I have so I can pay that bill, because I don't just like having bills hanging over my head. And that's the way Andrew Jackson felt. And he's either, as a nation, going to have to cut back, or he's going to have to sell something. At this point, the 5 civilized tribes were the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, Choctaw, and the Seminole. Where they are at is down in Mississippi, Alabama, Florida. This is prime area for growing cotton, and we're at that point where cotton is king, and it is developing the South, and it's becoming everything. So there were people that were asking to buy the land that was in these states, and the Native Americans were already there. The only thing Andrew Jackson could do is to remove the Native Americans and then sell that land. Andrew Jackson, once the Native Americans have moved off, will sell the land, and for the only time in America's history, we will have a national debt of 0. He did exactly what he's going to say to do, and he pays off the national debt. It is at the expense of the Native Americans, but once again, if you go back to what Andrew Jackson has gone through with the Red Stick Wars down in Alabama, fighting the Seminole down in Florida, and having to deal with other things down in Mississippi. But we also know that Andrew Jackson, even though we talk about him removing the Indians, we need to remember that Andrew Jackson wasn't just removing the Indians to remove them. He was trying to get the land. The Native Americans that had actually helped him fight in the Red Stick Seminoles, which were several of the Cherokee, they were given a pass so that they could stay and live on the land. Some of the Native American tribes, like the Creek and the Choctaw, they were excited about moving because we were offering them more land out west, and they were away from the white people, which was really helping them out considering what we had done to them. So Andrew Jackson is going to pay off the national debt with the Indian Removal Act and everything. Like I said, as you can see from the notes there, it was land that was desirable for agriculture. That's the big reason people wanted it for cotton. What happens then is the Cherokee is the one we're going to talk about mostly because that's here in Tennessee. They were looking for a way to sue the national government. It's not that they just wanted to sue the national government. They wanted to take it to court and in court be found that they were a nation of people, because if the Supreme Court says that they are a nation of people, then we can't just kick them off their land. They are their own nation. So the Cherokee, like I say, were trying to prove that there were people in court, and that's what happens with Samuel Worcester. Samuel Worcester takes it all the way to the Supreme Court over the fact of making them pay to have a permit to be on Indian land, and the Supreme Court decides that the Cherokee are a nation of people, and that should make it harder for them to be evicted off their land. And in fact, it does go to the Supreme Court, and that's where John Marshall says Jackson cannot break the treaties and they can remain on their land. Andrew Jackson does what he wants to anyway, so he's going to decide to remove the Indians anyhow to pay off the national debt. So even though the Supreme Court did go on the side of the Cherokee, it never really helped them. In 1832, you're going to have the Fox removed from Illinois. In 1834, you have the Choctaw removed to Mississippi. 1836, the Creek are removed from Alabama. And here's the thing that's very interesting for us to know. We always talk about Andrew Jackson with the Cherokee removal because he did start the Indian Removal Act. But he leaves office in 1836 and heads home back to Nashville at the Hermitage. The Cherokee are not removed until 1838. It is the president after Jackson. Sing your little song, you know it. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Adams, Jackson, Van Buren. And so that is who the actual one is that removes the Cherokee from Tennessee and Georgia. Andrew Jackson was not even involved in that. I would have liked to have seen what happened if Andrew Jackson would have been in office at this time because, like I say, Andrew Jackson, I don't think just hated the Cherokee. He was trying to accomplish something. If you remember from what we discussed about Andrew Jackson earlier, he has a Native American son that is adopted, and so it's not just a hatred thing. I would have liked to have seen how he would have handled what happens to the Cherokee because the Cherokee are going to go through what's called the Trail of Tears. This is the forced removal of the Cherokee. They are rounded up and they're brought to Chattanooga. If you've ever had a chance to go down to Chattanooga and you see the aquarium right there, there is a set of steps that goes down right next to it, next to the water, and that is called Ross's Landing. It's because Chief John Ross, that's where all the Cherokee were rounded up, is right there in Chattanooga. There's only 17,000 Cherokee brought there. A lot of times when we talk about the Trail of Tears, we get this picture of 200,000, 300,000 people. It's not that quite a massive of a thing. It is 17,000, which is a lot of people, but they are brought to Chattanooga. And it is called the Trail of Tears because 4,000 of them are going to die along the way, almost 1/4 of them. What is very interesting about this was not the way our government had planned it. We talk about our government doing the Trail of Tears and we put the blame on them. The blame falls with two men from the Tennessee area. They had contracted to remove the Cherokee. Our government gave them money for wagons so that the people could have rides out to Oklahoma. They had given them money for blankets. They had given them money for food, for supplies along the way. So our government cut a huge check to these two guys to buy all these supplies and move the Cherokee. But what happens is these two men are the responsible for the Trail of Tears. They do not spend any of that money on any blankets, any food, any wagons. They just round them up and force walk them out to Oklahoma. And as they're walking along the way, so many die because of lack of food, lack of blankets, lack of wagons. What's also interesting, Samuel Worcester, the man we mentioned that was trying to do the court case for the Cherokee, actually as a white man walks with them all the way on the Trail of Tears out to Oklahoma, and when he gets there sets up a printing press and publishes the Bible for the Cherokee in their own language. After this dishonest contractor does the Trail of Tears, the next 10 years after that, you get the government showing up in Florida. We have what's called the Seminole Wars and everything like that. And that's where we're trying to drive the Seminole out of Florida. They keep driving them further and further down. Once we get past Orlando, we see what a cookie's going to cost down there or a hamburger meal, and we decide to leave it at that. So just kidding actually about that. But we actually do go about halfway down, and then at that point it starts to get swampy, and we're like, you know what, let them have it. And so that's why Florida State, in the southern part of the state, or in that state, is known as the Florida State Seminoles. The next thing about Andrew Jackson is in 1845 he is going to contract tuberculosis and die from it. He still kept his sense of humor all the way to the end. It was like 2 weeks before he died. Somebody asked him how his health was, and he said, "Leave me alone. I'm dying as fast as I can." The Andrew Jackson's deathbed statement is one that I really enjoy, because Andrew Jackson, he's laying there, he's dying, he's looking around the room, he's got his Native American son in there, he's got several of his servants and everything, and he says, "I hope to meet you all in heaven, both black and white," is his last statement that he makes, which shows you in 1845 for someone to be saying that blacks and whites and all races are going to end up in heaven. That was what people would call a liberal back then. But today we look at him and say he has hatred for the Native Americans. That's not what it was at all. It was a simple thing of fulfilling his campaign promises. The last thing you have to need to know, and it's just because it's a standard, is the Tennessee State Constitution. In 1834, we had talked about they have to write a new constitution because the state has changed. It is far from that days of the long hunters and everything when we first became a state. And they had to change it because it used to say that voters had to own property. We've got so many people living in Tennessee that did not own property but still deserve the right to vote. The Constitution in 1834 also denied free African Americans the right to vote or to own guns. We're taking away their Second Amendment right, which is totally wrong, and we are taking away their voting rights. It also provides a state Supreme Court. Before that, we had a state court, but it wasn't as set up like the other state Supreme Courts. And this is ratified in 1835. And then we will be on to Chapter 16 with the next ones next week. So be ready to adjust the volume as I get too loud and go to a wide-angle lens for me. So thank you much. Appreciate it.